Rob here, and in this video we're going to carry on with the element about audiences by asking ourselves who should be allowed to play these games. So we're going to be looking at regulatory aspects. So the key theory here is Sonia Livingstone and Peter Lund's theory of regulation. The idea that there's an underlying struggle in recent regulation policy between the need to further the interests of citizens by offering protection from harmful and offensive material, and the need to further the interests of consumers by ensuring choice while promoting market competition. So in particular we're going to be looking at the idea of who should be allowed to play these video games and what effect it might have on them. So it's also worth bearing in mind that regulating stuff is all very well and good, but in a globalized world of global media corporations and convergent media technologies, the ability for audiences to access materials and bypass regulation sort of like policies puts the entire approach to media regulation at risk. So, legally or illegally, if you can, lie about your age to download a game off the internet or just pirate it, doesn't matter what it's being regulated as. So back in the days we could only buy things from shops, for example, when it comes to video games. There was a built-in gatekeeper because the shop wouldn't sell it to you if you weren't old enough. That's not the case anymore. Right, so, well, it is the case, you can't buy the shop, but there are other ways around it, by means. So, why do we need to regulate media? Well, this is where effects theory comes in by Albert Bandura. There's an idea that the media can implant ideas straight into the minds of audiences. The Howard Laswell called the hypodermic needle theory. This idea that audiences acquire attitudes, emotional responses and new styles of conduct through modelling, and that media representations of transgressive behaviour such as violence or physical aggression can lead audience members to imitate those forms of behaviour. Now this is an age-old concern. It goes back at least to the 1920s when we first started to see regulation. Cinema originally, really. So there were concerns over violence in cinema that led to the introduction in America of things like the Hays Code. I think it was 1934, but I could be wrong on that one. That, restricted what was allowed to be seen in films. So there have been throughout history various moral panics and folk devils, which is a standard Cohen theory, in which various media have been accused of corrupting people, specifically young people. In the 1950s it was horror comics, in the 1980s it was video nasties, and since then a lot of this has been put onto video games. The idea being that video gaming is a much more active activity rather than a passive one. You are not simply watching acts of violence, but you are controlling acts of violence. Now I'm talking violence here in inverted commas because there is no real violence in a video game. When you play a video game, no one is actually getting hurt. No one is being killed. It's just a game. It's pretend. But the idea is that if you are constantly exposed to even simulated acts of violence, you are going to believe that violence is an acceptable way to behave, an acceptable way to, deal with disputes. So you are modelling your behaviour on what you see. Now, throughout history, there have been many attempts to blame video games for violence. Grand Theft Auto in particular has come in for a lot of stick. But there is no compelling evidence whatsoever to suggest that playing video games causes violence. Now, that's not to say that people who commit acts of violence may not do it in the style of video game violence, but that's not to say it causes them to be violent in the first place. But this is why it's considered that we need regulation. In particular, it's about protecting children. Now, we tend in this country to go for a regulation rather than a censorship approach. Now, that's not to say that some games can't, and indeed haven't, been banned outright. There have been games which are considered so exceptional in terms of their violence or their misogyny that they've simply been flat out banned. They've been refused a certificate and therefore they can't be sold in this country. They're few and far between, they're quite rare. The last big one I can think of was the Manhunt game, which was banned on the Nintendo Wii because you had to use the hand controllers to operate it, and it was a game where you would go around and cut people's throats, and you actually had to mime cutting their throat to do it, and that was considered a step too far. So there have been elements of things being banned, but usually it's about regulation. You regulate it and let the audience decide whether they're going to play it or not. Now, that does mean to say that if a game has got an 18 PEGI rating, that you can buy it if you're under 18. You can't. Right? There are laws to stop you doing that. Shops can't sell you those games, or they can be prosecuted. However, if your parents buy the game for you and you're under 18 and let you play it, that's up to them to decide. They can decide whether you are mature enough to be able to play it or not. They probably shouldn't be, but if they do, it's their fault. And this ties in with cultivation theory by Jules Gerbner, the idea that repeated exposure to patterns of representation over long periods can shape and influence the way which people perceive the world around them. And, as I said, if you are constantly exposed to acts of violence, the idea is you become desensitized to them and are no longer shocked by them, and they may indeed make you violent. Now, if for those of you who might be doing sociology and psychology, you might be able to say there's a big difference between aggression and violence. So, there's a big difference between being agitated. We all know that playing video games can be pretty frustrating. And we might shout and scream at the TV and throw our controllers around and our hissy fits when things are going badly for us. But that's a big difference between actually causing physical harm to somebody. Right? So, there are big debates around this. I'm not going into that right now. Right? Beyond our remit at this point. Now, up until July 2012, video games were regulated by the British Board of Film Classification, the BBFC. The BBFC had traditionally been there for classifying films. But because they were already doing this, video games got lumped onto them as well. But it got to the point where they couldn't handle all of this business. They couldn't do films and video games, it was too much for them. Plus, they were better off giving it to someone who's an expert. So, there was also a need to standardise this across the European Union. Remember, of course, we were still in the European Union at that point. So, we saw the creation of the Video Standards Council, VSC, and there was a PEGI rating created, the Pan-European Gaming Information System. It was very similar to the cinema regulations, and there were similar certificates. PEGI system is an attempt to harmonise the protection of children across Europe, to standardise it, so we didn't have different systems in different countries. It just made the entire thing cheaper and more efficient, Once it could be regulated, once it could be sold across all of Europe, and you didn't have to have a different system for each different country. So it was more efficient, it was cheaper. Now, this is the PEGI rating for Assassin's Creed 3. This is the remastered one. I couldn't find the one specifically for Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation from the day, from 2012. This is a more recent release from 2019, which was available across platforms, PS4 at that point, PlayStation, Xbox One and Nintendo Switch. So this we got ported onto different platforms. So this package included Assassin's Creed 3 remastered in HD, and all the DLC and expansion packs, including Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, which had also been remastered in high definition. So this game was rated PEGI 18, therefore is only suitable for people of 18 years and over. As you can see by the infographics down here, it was because of its violence and its bad language. So it says, advice to consumers, the game is rated PEGI 18, with strict availability to adults only. It is not suitable for anyone below this age. This rating has been given due to strong violence, violence against vulnerable and defenseless characters, motiveless killings of innocent characters, and use of sexual expletives. In other words, you can basically murder anyone you want in this game. You can kill innocent bystanders. So this says, the game contains frequent strong violence. You can impale victims' heads with a bayonet. You can remove the scalps of enemies you've killed. You can kill defenseless people in the streets, and there is also infrequent use of sexual expletives. So, bad language essentially. Much like a film, really. You know, an 18 certificate film would get a certificate for exactly the same reasons. So this is the PEGI system that we use in Europe. In America, they have the ESRB, Entertainment Software Ratings Board, which is very similar. Again, very similar to America's cinema ratings. And they classify the film as mature, 17 plus. In America, they have the NC-17 rating for cinema, which is the equivalent of 18 over here. And mature is the equivalent of that, I guess. This is the older one. This is the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360. But as you can see, it's for the same things: blood, suggestive themes, and violence. As it says, as players, you can complete various missions. You can kill enemies with a variety of weapons. You can engage in melee-style sword fights with soldiers, resulting in screams of pain, occasional slow-motion effects. Frequent and large blood splatter effects occur when the enemies are stabbed or impaled. During one cutscene, the ship captain flirts with Aveline while suggestively touching his crotch area and thrusting his pelvis. But you're all welcome back to my cabin. I've manhood 4, I don't think, or we can consult right here. So, again, sexual themes and violence. It seems to be less bothered about the bad language than the European one. But same basic reasons why it's getting a mature rating. So, go back and make notes on that. PEGI 18, mature ASRB rating, and it's about sex and violence essentially. So that's what that comes down to. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of whether video games cause violence. It's not really that relevant. The point is, they've been classified as not suitable for people under the age of 18 because they are violent, because children shouldn't be playing this, frankly. You know, even children might find it disturbing, they might find it upsetting. They shouldn't be exposed to violence and bad language. Having said that, if you're an adult, you are big enough and old enough to make that decision yourself. So that's what it's about. It's about classification and advice, consumer advice, not censorship. Alright? So, obviously we're restricting our audiences to people over the age of 17 or 18, depending on what market you're in. As I said before in the other videos, these PowerPoints are all available in the OneDrive, and if you've got any questions, you know where I am. I'll see you in the next one.